time now is nearly 24 minutes past 9. Childhood in the Middle Ages is the title of our next programme. Geoffrey Richards, Professor of Cultural History at the University of Lancaster, considers new concepts about children in the medieval world.
Until quite recently, medieval history was primarily a matter of kings and popes, battles and parliaments. But in the past few years, historians have increasingly turned to social and cultural history in an attempt to recover something of the lives of ordinary people in the medieval world. As a result, many long-established notions about medieval history have been questioned and overturned. This is now happening to the ideas about childhood in the Middle Ages. For 30 years, historians have, for the most part, accepted the view articulated by Philippe Ariès in his influential book Centuries of Childhood, first published in 1960, that the Middle Ages had no concept of childhood. He based his argument on several factors: the absence of visual representations of children, claiming that when they appeared, it was as miniature adults; the high infant mortality rate, which he said led parents to develop a defense mechanism against emotional involvement with their children; the evidence of child abandonment and infanticide; and the absence of that sentimentalization of children that was a feature of later ages. But recently, historians have begun to question aspects of this hypothesis. It has now been effectively exploded by two new books of wide-ranging scholarship, acute perception, and warm-hearted humanity. Shulamit Shahar, in Childhood in the Middle Ages, demonstrates that every one of the premises of Ariès' argument is wrong. And John Boswell, in The Kindness of Strangers, places an entirely new interpretation on the well-established tradition of child abandonment. It is now clear that not only were there many pictures of children as children in the Middle Ages, but perhaps more importantly, there is abundant evidence that they were viewed as children and were loved as children. Throughout the Middle Ages, the primary role of women in society was as wives and mothers. As a role model for them, the Church assiduously promoted the cult of the Virgin Mary. Her image, as a loving mother cherishing her child, was widely popular, and was clearly internalized by the population as something to be emulated. Children were depicted by didactic writers as a source of joy and a trust from God. The sentimentalization of children can be seen in the popularity of paintings of the massacre of the innocents and the flight of the Holy Family into Egypt. It can be seen in the developing cult, from the 12th century onwards, of the baby Jesus as an all-knowing, all-seeing, wonder-working child, and in the first appearance, from the 13th century, of the Christmas manger with the ox and donkey attending the Christ child. It can be seen in the organization of processions of children by communities in times of crisis, in the confident hope that their angelic innocence would turn away the wrath of heaven. Culturally and theologically, two images of childhood existed side by side. The negative image, which derived from St. Augustine, held that a child was born in sin as a consequence of lust, commenced itself to sin at 7, and by the end of childhood was steeped in sin. This contrasted with the much gentler and more positive view of childhood deriving from Christ's love of children, which saw the childhood years as a time of innocence, purity and faith lost in adulthood. But both these views are essentially those of theologians, and not, one is tempted to say, of real people. The medical writer Bartholomeus Anglicus penned in 1230 a portrait of small boys which comes much closer to reality and is still recognizable to this day. Living without thought or care, loving only to play, fearing no danger more than being beaten with a rod, always hungry and hence always disposed to various infirmities from being overfed, wanting everything they see, quick to laughter and as quick to tears, resisting their mother's efforts to wash and comb them, and no sooner clean than dirty again. The letters, memoirs, and court records which have survived give abundant evidence of affection for children. The Tuscan Lapo Mazzei, for instance, writing during the Black Death, recorded, "I have seen my 2 sons, the older and the middle one, die in my arms in a few hours. God knows what my hopes were for the first, who was already a companion to me and a father with me to the others, and what progress he had made. Think how my heart broke, seeing the little ones suffer, and their mother not well or strong, and hearing the words of the older one. And to think of 3 dead." These are not the words of someone who has emotionally distanced himself from his children, and they are not atypical. Modern psychologists distinguish various developmental stages in childhood. So did the writers of the medieval didactic, medical and theological works analysed by Shahar. They saw three principal stages. First, there was infantia, or infancy, which was from birth to 7 years old, and was the period of child dependency, when speech and understanding were imperfect, and there was a special duty on parents to protect and nurture. The second stage was pueritia, childhood, from 7 to 12 in the case of girls, and 14 in the case of boys. Even then, girls were deemed to mature earlier than boys. This was the period in which children began to express themselves properly, to be schooled, and to distinguish between good and evil, though they were not yet considered capable of criminal responsibility. Lastly came adolescentia, adolescence, from 12 or 14 to adulthood. This was the time when children became sexually active and underwent identity crises as their adult personalities began to form. Adulthood usually dated from marriage, which in the case of girls was often 10 years earlier than boys. For most boys were expected to establish themselves in a career before settling down, whereas marriage was the career for most girls. Childbirth was universally recognized as dangerous, both for mother and infant. It's estimated that 1/3 of all babies died at birth in the Middle Ages, and something like 25 in 1,000 women died in childbirth. Many women miscarried. Many were worn out by repeated pregnancies. Contraception was condemned by the Church, and anyway was highly unreliable, consisting as it did of various preparations, potions, amulets, and incantations. Only coitus interruptus provided any real hope of successful contraception. Most women gave birth at home, and within a few days after the birth, the child would be baptized to cleanse it of the sin of lust which had brought it into the world. Baptism was a great event, attended by joyous celebrations and the giving of presents, further evidence of the welcome nature of additions to the family. Parents placed great store by baptism, believing that it conferred supernatural protection and guaranteed an eventual place in heaven for the child. So widespread was this belief that even mothers who killed their children at birth often baptized them first to ensure that their souls were saved. Conversely, for children to die unbaptized was believed to put their souls in peril, and in the early Middle Ages, unbaptized children were sometimes buried with stakes through their hearts. Except in the upper classes where wet nurses were employed, children were breastfed, a procedure recommended by preachers, doctors, and medical writers because it reinforced the bond between mother and child. The use of the cradle was common to all sections of society from the 11th century onwards. Children were wrapped in swaddling bands with only the head protruding. The aim of these was to maintain the stability of the body and preserve warmth, because a baby's body was thought to be malleable like wax and in danger of malformation. Medical authorities believed that a crying child could be quietened by changing its swaddling clothes, changing its position, and singing it lullabies. They also believed that children needed smiles, hugs, and songs to make them feel wanted, and that walking and talking developed at different rates in different children. There is no reference in medieval medical works to toilet training. Shahar infers from this that since children in the Middle Ages were dressed in shirts with no underpants, and since medieval adults were much less private about excretion than their modern counterparts, children learned this at their own pace and by imitation. Experts stressed the importance of play in the early years, and in their games and with their toys, children learned language, movement, and socialization. Child beating, like wife beating, was universal. Spare the rod and spoil the child, although coined by Samuel Butler in the 17th century, was a dictum that would have gained wide social approval. But the aim was discipline and not destruction. As one 13th century law observed, if one beats a child until it bleeds, then it will remember. If one beats it to death, the law applies. How often the line between firm discipline and physical abuse was crossed, we shall never know. There was undoubtedly physical as well as sexual abuse of children in the Middle Ages. But that, sadly, has been a feature of every age, and one of the hardest to document. A regular feature of medieval life was the abandonment of children, the subject of John Boswell's new book. On the face of it, this practice would seem to support the theory of parental callousness. but Boswell argues persuasively against such an interpretation. There is an important distinction to be made between infanticide, killing of a child, and abandonment. Children were abandoned in the clear expectation that they would be found, taken in, and brought up by others, and the majority of them were. Society never imposed serious sanctions on the practice, and although the Church disapproved, it did so for two interesting reasons. Fear of the children going unbaptized and thus being denied their chance of heaven, and the danger of involuntary incest with an abandoned child growing up and having sex later with a parent or sibling in ignorance of the blood relationship. That objection, of course, assumes that most abandoned children will survive. So did medieval literature, in which the abandonment and survival of children was a regular theme. Boswell believes that the majority of rescued children grew up to be servants. The less fortunate ended up as prostitutes. The motives for abandonment varied, but were most often sheer poverty, the inability to support extra mouths, or shame, the desire to rid oneself of illegitimate or incestuous offspring. Surplus girls, who cost more to raise and provide for than they contributed to the household economy, and handicapped children, who were often believed to be changelings left by the devil or the fairies, often figured among the abandoned. But frequently, he argues, love featured among the motives, the desire for a child to get on and get a better upbringing than the parents could provide. So Boswell sees abandonment as a gentle but important regulator of European family life, checking demographic increase, correcting gender imbalance, and limiting the effects of poverty. It depended crucially on the kindness of strangers, and this was part of the culture, enhanced by the Christian injunction to charity and good neighbourliness. The situation changed dramatically in the 13th century with the creation of foundling hospitals, where abandoned children were consigned, and in which, Boswell reveals, the majority of inmates died within a few years, and those who survived and returned to society were stigmatized. So what seemed like a charitable development in fact substituted a dispassionate and often uncaring institutional provision for individual acts of genuine kindness. The second stage of childhood was dominated by education. Medieval scholars believed in education, seeing the child as a blank page to be filled with the values of his society, the beliefs of his faith, and the details of his and her gender roles. The mother was in charge of raising all the children up to the age of 7. Thereafter, the father took over the education of sons, leaving the daughters to the mother. Girls at every level of society had virtually no formal education, but were taught domestic skills and household management by their mothers, and instructed in the feminine virtues: modesty, chastity, humility, and obedience. Boys, at the higher levels of society, received both education and training. The sons of the nobility were sent away at 7 to the court of an uncle or friend to train for knighthood. They served first as page and then as squire before receiving the accolade. Military training took place between the ages of 12 and 15, with the boy learning riding, wrestling, archery, the use of sword and lance. Although the trainee knights lived as a separate group, they took part in the routine adult activities, like hunting and feasting. Thus they absorbed the basic values of the knightly code: heroism, loyalty, generosity, family pride, brotherhood, prowess, and honour. The fact of their being sent away did not necessarily betoken lack of love, any more than parents sending boys to public school in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was the custom of the caste, the means of meeting the right people, getting the right training, having a head start on the future. The training for the priesthood similarly began early and lasted many years. A child could be tonsured at 7 and serve in minor clerical orders, though the minimum age for admission to the priesthood was 25, reduced to 20 in 1311. The clergy tended to be drawn from the middle and upper classes, since literacy was required, and they were often recruited from the younger sons of noble and bourgeois families who had no chance of inheriting the family property, from the frail, bookish, and unworldly offspring for whom a career in the world seemed unpropitious. Some took holy orders out of spiritual vocation, others in search of an administrative career. It was to train intending clerics that elementary and grammar schools mushroomed in the 12th century with the revival and expansion of the towns. But schooling was characterized by long hours, cramped conditions, a boring curriculum and teaching methods, and severe discipline. Some children spent their formative years in monasteries. Up until the 12th century, children could be placed in monasteries at 5 or 6. They were known as oblates because they were child offerings by their parents to God, and they were irrevocably committed to a monastic life. But during the 12th century, there was growing opposition to the practice, and the view developed that a child should have the right to choose for itself, when it came of age, whether it wanted to live a monastic life. So in 1215, the practice of oblation was declared illegal by the Church, and if a child entered a monastery, it was given the right to refuse vows and return to the world when it came of age. But many of the new monastic orders formed in this period refused to accept children altogether. Children in monasteries were kept in a separate group. Although they were integrated into the daily monastic routine of communal prayers and services, child oblates had their own chapter house and their own masters. They were under the supervision of their masters continuously, even at night. They could not speak to other children, or indeed anyone, without permission. Offenders were whipped. They were thus subjected to a strict regime of physical and emotional discipline to encourage their vocation. St. Hugh of Lincoln, who entered a religious house at 8, lamented to friends in later life, "I never knew or learnt how to play." In all European towns, the majority of children of the bourgeoisie attended elementary schools, though often only for a short time. Those intending to become craftsmen embarked on an apprenticeship. The apprentice left home, moved in with his master, and learned his craft and his professional ethics by observing and assisting. The length of the apprenticeship varied from craft to craft. In 13th century Paris, a cook served a 2-year apprenticeship, a silversmith 10 years, but 7 to 8 years was the norm. Apprenticeship contracts were signed by parents and filed in the guild archives. The craft guild set the conditions and oversaw the training. Only a small proportion of girls undertook apprenticeships, but more learned the trade by working with their fathers, and sometimes they even took over the business. Women became a significant element in the merchant and craftsman class, though this class as a whole formed less than 10% of the population. Peasants received no formal education. They were integrated early into adult society and functioned as part of the household economy, but not as fully fledged adults. It was recognized that while children, they should perform supportive and auxiliary functions. So from 7, children ran errands, tended sheep and pigs, and carried food to field labourers. Initially, boys and girls did the same chores, but later there was a gender split, as girls learned spinning, weaving and cooking, and boys began ploughing and reaping, and thus both sexes moved on into adulthood. What is striking, then, about people in the Middle Ages is not how different they were from us in the modern world, but how similar. Medieval people had a clear concept of childhood. They understood children, childcare, and child psychology. They expected children to go through a process of growth and development, and indeed medieval children did develop, psychologically, physically, sexually and socially, much as they do today. The close-knit, affectionate family, cherishing its children, the neglectful and selfish family, brutalizing its children, existed side by side much as they do now. If anything, it is the present which is eroding childhood, forcing children before their time to become mini-adults and depriving them of a vital stage in their development. What the comprehensive refutation by Shahar and Boswell of the Ariès thesis suggests is that if historians have a fault, it is that they may rely too exclusively on their inevitably fragmentary and partial sources, and sometimes forget such timeless constraints as human nature, common sense, and universal biological impulses.
Childhood in the Middle Ages was written and read by Professor Geoffrey Richards. The producer was Rosemary Hart. Now some music by Telemann, a great adventurer in sound. First, a concerto for 4 unaccompanied violins.